Guess who I am? Guessed wrong. I'm Mr. Beat. But guess who this is? Okay, well, you cheated. You knew who it was because you clicked on the video.
Yes, that's James Monroe, who was the 5th President of the United States.
Most Americans have no idea who James Monroe is.
If I asked any random person, tell me 3 facts about Thomas Jefferson, I bet you a lot of people could do it. But if I asked you the same question about James Monroe, I think people would have a hard time coming up with anything more than was a president, maybe Monroe Doctrine.
And we actually know very little about him compared to the other founding father presidents.
And yet, when he was president, he was extremely popular.
I mean, political polling didn't really exist back then, but we do have evidence that most everybody loved Monroe, just like everybody loves Raymond, when he was president. If you read all newspapers from the time, they're all kissing his butt. His first election win was one of the most dominant presidential election victories in American history. After he won, he toured the country, and huge crowds gathered to cheer his arrival, even in states he didn't win in. When he ran for re-election, he ran virtually unopposed and won every state in the country.
I repeat, he was so freaking popular that he won every single state in the country. Well, so what? So did George Washington when he ran. Well, yeah, but everybody knows who George Washington is. They don't know who James Monroe is. Shut up, you nitwit. That guy. Here's the story of James Monroe, the most popular president you've never heard of.
James Monroe,
James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758, in this part of Virginia, the Northern Neck, where a bunch of important founding father dudes were born.
You know, obscure folks like George Washington.
Of course, Washington was 26 years old when James was born. James's dad, Spence, was a farmer and carpenter. He grew tobacco and made furniture and was not a fan of British colonial rule, at one time participating in protests against the Stamp Act. We don't know a whole lot about his mother, Elizabeth, but we do know she came from a respected family and helped teach young James how to read. When James was 11, he began attending a school run by the influential Reverend Archibald Campbell. He'd get up before dawn to walk several miles through the forest to school, carrying his books and musket the whole way, I assume for protection. When James was 14, his mother died shortly after giving birth to his younger brother, Joseph. 2 years later, his dad got sick and died. At just 16, James was an orphan in charge of the family farm. Now the sole provider for his sister and brothers. He now owned 800 acres and his father's enslaved people.
But just when it looked like James was going to have to drop out of school, his Uncle Joe came to the rescue.
Joseph Jones and his wife Mary Jones, who had no kids of their own, decided to take care of the family and help James finish school. Joseph got James enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, at the time the capital of Virginia, and due to his connections as a member of the House of Burgesses, Joseph also introduced James to A-list Virginians like Patrick Henry and George Washington. Holy crap, you serious? George? Dang.
James was living it up in college when his studies got suddenly interrupted by the American War of Independence.
And boy, did James get caught up in it. He ditched the books for guns, joining the local militia. After the British governor of Virginia, John Murray, tried to confiscate their weapons, Monroe was one of 24 militiamen who stormed his palace to get them back on June 24th, 1775. At the time, he was just 17 years old.
Dang, Monroe! That little fella ain't messing around. Imagine like you're like in college hanging out in the dorms. You're like, oh, I gotta go fight a war to like start a new country. I'll be back.
It's like, yo, the governor is stockpiling arms. We gotta go get him. And they did.
By early 1776, Monroe had dropped out of college and joined the 3rd Virginia Regiment of the Continental Army. Due to his intelligence, he quickly moved up the ranks, soon becoming a lieutenant and serving under Captain William Washington. Yes, apparently a distant cousin of George Washington. By 1777, Monroe's group got called up north to serve under George Washington in what became known as the New York and New Jersey Campaign, a series of battles in which the Continental Army fought against the British for control of both New York City and New Jersey. Monroe fought heroically and with distinction in multiple battles, including the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Germantown, and the Battle of Monmouth.
In most of the battles he fought in, he lost.
Oh, okay. Here's a famous painting for you. Most of you probably recognize it, but for those of you who don't, it's called Washington Crossing the Delaware, and it shows several key figures of the Battle of Trenton, an important surprise victory for the Continental Army after a series of defeats that gave the troops a real morale boost. Yep, there's Washington, and some say this dude here is Monroe. But that painting is not historically accurate at all. Monroe actually crossed the Delaware on a different boat.
But he absolutely fought in that battle, all right. Heck, he nearly died.
He got hit by a musket ball while leading a charge against enemy cannons. The shot knocked him out and struck an artery, causing him to nearly bleed to death.
We would probably never even know who James Monroe was if it weren't for a doctor named Riker. He would have bled to death except for the fact that Dr. Riker was there to put a clamp on it and everything else and get him done.
He eventually, somehow, fully recovered, but the bullet would stay lodged in his shoulder for the rest of his life. By 1779, the war had been going much better for the Continental Army, and Monroe had been promoted to the rank of major. However, after not being able to find enough soldiers to recruit, and there being too many officers already, he decided to take a break from fighting in battles and go back to school.
The war had been slowing down anyway.
He returned to the College of William and Mary, where he studied, you guessed it, law. While there, he became friends with Thomas Jefferson, who actually talked him into entering politics. In 1782, Jefferson helped him get elected into the Virginia House of Delegates. Monroe never finished law school.
Meh, he didn't want to become a lawyer anyway. He thought it seemed too boring. Monroe thought politics seemed much more exciting.
In 1783, around the time the American War of Independence ended, Monroe got appointed to the Continental Congress, thus launching his national political career, baby.
Keep in mind that he was still a young man during this time, just in his mid-20s.
Due to this, he often relied on Jefferson for advice. But after Jefferson went off to France, Monroe often got advice from another genius founding father dude. Oh, and another James Madison. Despite running against each other for Congress at one point, the two would become lifelong friends. Monroe spent much of his time in the Continental Congress thinking about how Americans would settle the land west of the Appalachian Mountains and how the United States government should manage this western land. Still, he got frustrated with how little Congress got done under the country's first Constitution.
That's Constitution with a lowercase c.
The Articles of Confederation. In 1785, Monroe met Elizabeth Courtwright while in New York City, which at the time was the capital city of the country. He was 27, she was just 17. But the two soon fell in love. They married at Elizabeth's dad's house in NYC on February 16th, 1786, living there with him until Monroe's term in Congress was up. They then moved into Monroe's Uncle Joseph's house back in Virginia. That was where their first daughter, Eliza, was born in early December.
Yeah, we don't know exactly when she was born, okay? Heck, I'm not even sure when I was born. Maybe I was born yesterday.
Anyway, James and Elizabeth would remain very close the rest of their lives. Whenever James had to travel around the world, Elizabeth would be right by his side. After finally passing the bar exam and becoming a lawyer, Monroe remembered that he hated being a lawyer after all and returned to politics. In 1787, he got reelected to the Virginia House of Delegates.
1787, you remember 1787, don't you? Don't you? You do you not? Yes?
That's when the Constitutional Convention happened, Broseph. The gathering of 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 original states that ultimately got rid of the Articles of Confederation and created the U.S. Constitution. Well, Monroe didn't want Virginia to formally approve of this new Constitution without first adding a Bill of Rights, making him technically an anti-federalist at odds with his friend James Madison. Well, despite Monroe's opposition, Virginia formally approved the Constitution on June 25th, 1788. In 1790, the Virginia legislators appointed Monroe to become a U.S. Senator. Heck yeah! As senator, he consistently voted against bills that increased the power of the federal government. He particularly was against Alexander Hamilton's National Bank proposal. While Monroe didn't write any bills himself as senator, he is a big reason why U.S. Senate sessions are open to the public to promote transparency and accountability.
Yep, before Monroe pushed for this, the Senate met in private.
It was when Monroe was a senator that he began to align himself with the Democratic-Republican Party.
Not to be confused with the Democratic Party or Republican Party.
It seemed like a cool party since it literally existed to oppose Hamilton and his Federalist Party, plus Monroe's buddies, Jefferson and Madison, started it. So, bonus. Now, even though President George Washington aligned more with Hamilton, he tremendously respected Monroe, and in May 1794, asked him to be his new U.S. minister to France. This was a big-time diplomatic post at a time when the French Revolution was arguably at its most chaotic.
It's hard to turn Washington down.
Monroe said yes, and in June, he and his family began the long journey to Paris.
They arrived in Paris in August. Hey, there were flight delays. Just kidding. Planes didn't exist back then. They had to take a ship, okay?
Anyway, they arrived to a warm welcome by the French National Convention, which had recently executed Maximilien Robespierre and ended the Reign of Terror. Monroe gave a speech praising the French Revolution, in which he got a standing ovation. Well, this, of course, freaked out Federalists back home, as it showed that Monroe was picking a side in the ongoing dispute between France and Britain. Oops. After the Jay Treaty set up peaceful trade relations between the United States and Britain, Monroe felt undermined and sidelined, especially after many French citizens talked trash about it. After Monroe failed to defend the Jay Treaty, Washington removed Monroe from the position. He and his family sailed back to the United States in the spring of 1797, shortly after John Adams had become the second president. By then, Eliza was fluent in French.
He spent much of the next couple years trying to repair his reputation, even attacking George Washington in order to do so.
He wrote a 400-page book defending his time as U.S. Minister to France, and yep, in it, accused Washington of betraying American ideals. This was a rare thing to do back then, to just openly criticize the beloved Washington. Indeed, this book made many Federalists, in particular, hate him.
Meanwhile, Jefferson talked his friend into buying up some property near Monticello And so Monroe did. He bought the property I'm standing on right now, and he began to build a house here. You could probably see Monticello from here if those trees weren't in the way. Highland, Highland, Highland. It's called Highland. Monroe lived here off and on for the rest of his life.
Just like his neighbor and friend, Jefferson, Monroe grew tobacco on this large plantation. By this time, he owned nearly 200 enslaved people. Similar to Madison and Jefferson, Monroe personally was against slavery, yet hypocritically refused to free his own slaves. Well, except for one. Also similar to Madison and Jefferson, Monroe realized that enslaved people were his main source of wealth, and giving them up meant giving up the relatively comfortable life he lived. Also similar to Madison and Jefferson, Monroe had a lot of debt and often sold his enslaved persons to try to pay them off. Unlike Madison and Jefferson, he rarely spoke up about slavery at all.
This was the home of an entire community of enslaved people. At least 53 enslaved people lived here for all or part of their lives, and they were here all the time, unlike Monroe.
While Highland was being built, the Monroes moved here to the University of Virginia. Well, the university didn't exist yet, but before the university existed, this is where they lived, and Monroe had a law office here. In fact, it's behind me right now. He did a lot of traveling, so he wasn't actually here, but when he was here, if you know what I mean. Today, these are the oldest buildings on campus.
It was during this time that Monroe tried to be a lawyer again, but remember, he hated being a lawyer. So,
lucky for him, in 1799, Virginians elected him to be their next governor. Though the office was mostly ceremonial and weak under Virginia's constitution, as governor, Monroe did respond to what became known as Gabriel's Rebellion, a planned slave revolt aimed at taking over Richmond and ending slavery in Virginia. Monroe responded by mobilizing the state militia and declaring martial law. As governor, Monroe's family grew. James and Elizabeth had their second child, James, who tragically died as a toddler, and their third child, Maria, born on April 8th, 1802.
that really was her birthday.
And then Monroe's neighbor called him up to see if he'd like to go back to France.
I'm talking about Jefferson, who by this time was, what do you call it? President of the United States or something like that?
Jefferson wanted Monroe to go to France to negotiate the purchase of Louisiana.
Call it the Louisiana Purchase.
Yep, he and Robert Livingston were the two main dudes who bought the Louisiana Territory from France for just $15 million, nearly doubling the size of the country overnight. After this, Jefferson appointed Monroe as U.S. Minister to Great Britain, and so he moved his family to London. Unfortunately, the British did not welcome Monroe as warmly as the French did a few years before. During Monroe's tenure, he tried to negotiate an end to impressments, the nasty habit of kidnapping American sailors and forcing them to join the British Navy. While Monroe did get a new trade deal with Britain, he wasn't able to get them to commit to ending impressment.
Yeah, Jefferson and Madison, who by now was his Secretary of State, were both not impressed with that. See what I did there? Boom! Chaka-laka-laka.
Jefferson didn't even submit Monroe's trade deal to the Senate, and for the next several years, the British would continue to harass American ships. Well, this made Monroe turn against his buddies, Jefferson and Madison, and he basically resigned from his post in Great Britain.
Returning home once again to Virginia. Yeah, here. But actually, the house isn't here anymore. Like this house that's behind me, it's a lie the whole time. This is some other dude's house. He built it like 30 years after he died. For years, they thought that, a separate structure. Oh, no, this is actually what's left of his old house, right?
Yeah, there was some question about, is that white structure, that remaining wing, is that really a remaining wing of Monroe's house? and what happened to the rest of it. He left no pictures of his home. He doesn't really describe it in detail, but there are 3 fire insurance policies that describe the same dimensions of the same structure, and they all mention that it had a stone foundation. That little house over there has a brick foundation. It wasn't until 2012 when we got a new executive director who happens to be an archaeologist by trade that we really opened up the matter with a new perspective. What we found very quickly, a large 2-wing stone foundationed structure too far away from that White House to really match up to those blueprints of the fire insurance policy, but with a ton of material that quickly confirmed that rumor of a fire from a long time ago.
Okay, but anyway.
He once again managed his plantation and once again gave it another go as a lawyer, but he didn't like being a lawyer so much. Yes, we know he didn't like being a lawyer so much, so let me guess, did he go back into politics? No. I mean, yeah, he went back into politics. But this time, it seemed that he had to work his way back up. And he did.
In 1810, he returned to Virginia's House of Delegates. In 1811, he once again became the state's governor. And then, the now president, James Madison, apparently was no longer mad at Monroe because he asked him to be his U.S. Secretary of State. Madison knew that, quite frankly, no one else in the country was more qualified than James Monroe for that position. He officially began in that role on April 2nd, 1811.
Monroe was back, baby. Let's go!
Now 52 years old, Monroe returned to the federal government at a time when American-British relations were as bad as they had been since the American War of Independence. The British were attacking American ships, stealing stuff, blocking trade routes, aiding American Indian resistance against the Americans out west, and yes, still impressing American sailors. On June 1st, 1812, Madison formally asked Congress to declare war on Britain, and Monroe was all about it. During what became known as the War of 1812,
well, that's a clever name.
Monroe spent a lot of time trying to keep both France and Spain out of the war.
The war did not go very well for the United States.
In August 1814, British troops invaded and burned public buildings in Washington, D.C., including both the White House and U.S. Capitol. Both President Madison and Monroe had to flee the city. From across the Potomac over in Virginia, Monroe watched the capital city burn to the ground. Due to how disastrous the war was going, Madison forced his Secretary of War, John Armstrong, to resign. Monroe stepped in to lead both the state and War departments at the same time during arguably the most dangerous time of the war.
He is the only American to hold 2 cabinet secretary positions simultaneously.
Under Monroe's leadership, the United States was able to defend both Baltimore and New Orleans. While the War of 1812 technically ended in a draw, Americans felt that they had won by standing up to the British yet again, and this sparked a wave of patriotism. And just like that, James Monroe was one of the most popular men in the country.
Based on this popularity, Monroe became the easy favorite to take Madison's place as president.
The war had severely weakened the Federalist Party, and Monroe very easily defeated his main opponent, Rufus King, in the presidential election of 1816. He carried 183 electoral votes to King's 34, 16 of 19 states. Whoa-ness.
Thank you. Few American presidents were more qualified than James Monroe was for this position. Even his cabinet was top-notch.
By the time he was president, he was no longer a partisan hack. Since Monroe prioritized national unity and balance, he had a cabinet from different parts of the country and a diverse set of political beliefs. First off, he had John Quincy Adams as the Secretary of State, son of former President John Adams and a former political opponent from Massachusetts. Adams must have been shocked when Monroe asked him to do the job.
It'd be like Donald Trump asking Hunter Biden to be his Secretary of State. Could you even imagine?
Representing Southern interests and more states' rights, Monroe had William Crawford as his Secretary of the Treasury. He had the wild card William Wirt as his Attorney General, and even had John Calhoun as his Secretary of War.
Monroe kicked off his presidency by doing something that no prior American president had ever done before. Go on tour.
In the summer of 1817, Monroe traveled on horseback from D.C. to Maryland to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then all the way up to Maine in an effort to unify the country. Wearing an American Revolution-era military uniform, huge friendly crowds greeted him wherever he went, even in seemingly hostile territory, like Boston, where a newspaper famously declared that the country had entered an era of good feelings.
He wore the closest thing he could find to a Continental Army uniform. And so while he toured, he didn't only tour as the current president. The crowd would be looking at him and they're thinking of their father who fought in the Revolution, or their husband, or their brother, or their beloved friend who maybe didn't come back.
Today, Monroe's presidency is synonymous with the era of good feelings, marking a rare time in American history in which the country wasn't that politically divided. Monroe went on 2 more goodwill tours the following year, one down south and one out west.
And the first 2 years of his presidency couldn't have gone much better.
3 new states joined the country, and the country's population was quickly growing. He settled border disputes with British Canada up north and out west. After at first being quite upset at Andrew Jackson for invading Florida without his permission, his administration set up a treaty with Spain to take over Florida, the more legit way, I guess. The Adams-Onis Treaty for real.
But things weren't all gravy.
Monroe was president during the a big financial crisis caused by too much money being created in response to too much land speculation. It led to really high unemployment, bank failures, and foreclosures, and Monroe felt helpless trying to reverse its course. Despite this, Monroe was so popular as president that he ran for re-election in 1820 virtually unopposed. The only other president to pull that off was George Washington. Monroe won every state in this election and got all but one of the electoral votes. Even Federalist electors voted for him. Holy woe-ness.
But underneath all that unity were growing divisions, especially over the expansion of slavery out west.
When Missouri wanted to become a state, it wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, meaning it would make slavery legal there. Well, this would upset the balance of slave states and free states in the country.
Fortunately, Congress calmed everybody down with a solution that we now call the Missouri Compromise.
It admitted Missouri as a slave state, but also added Maine as a free state, adding that any future states north of this line of latitude had to be free states as well.
Monroe signed the compromise, easing tensions between the North and South for now. Sure kicked that can down the road. Of course, the biggest part of Monroe's legacy as president came with what we now call the Monroe Doctrine.
Mostly written by John Quincy Adams, actually.
Wait, why isn't it called the Quincy Adams Doctrine? Is that just a mouthful?
Well, Monroe actually gave the speech, spelling it all out, on December 2nd, 1823. Anyway, the Monroe Doctrine said that the entire Western Hemisphere of the globe ought to be closed off to new European colonization, and that any European interference in the Americas would be seen as a threat to the security of the United States. Even though the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really enforceable, at least not immediately, it would become a big cornerstone of American foreign policy over the next 2 centuries.
It's pretty much the third major document of the birth of our country. If you start with the Declaration of Independence, you start with the Constitution. But the Monroe Doctrine is giving us how we should behave with the rest of the world and how we should make sure the rest of the world behaves.
That's one of the few things that people do remember. They may not even remember James Monroe, the man, but they remember Monroe Doctrine.
A historian 100 years ago said that he knew two things about the Monroe Doctrine. One was that no American knows what the Monroe Doctrine exactly is, and the other is that no American wants it to be tampered with. And I think that that's pretty much still the same.
Unfortunately, by the time Monroe's presidency was over, the country had become divided again, and Monroe did not endorse a successor, leading to a ridiculously chaotic presidential election in 1824.
Hey, it made for a good video, though. Monroe returned to Virginia after his presidency.
Monroe spent his retirement devoted to reading and writing. He started a political theory book, but scrapped it after his son-in-law George Hay didn't think it was good. Hay suggested to Monroe that he write an autobiography instead, and Monroe agreed with that idea, but he died before he could finish writing it. He also spent a lot of time trying to solve his debt problems, even asking Congress to pay him back for his expenses back when he paid his way traveling the world as a diplomat. After his beloved Elizabeth died, he moved to New York City to live with his daughter, Maria. He spent his final days far from the land he once governed and loved so much. Monroe's heart would fail, likely due to complications from tuberculosis, on July 4th, 1831, thus becoming the third president to die on July 4th, exactly 5 years after fellow presidents Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the exact same day.
What, you think I'm making this all up, punks? I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. History is filled with cool coincidences like this, man.
Anyway, he was 73.
We had already went to Monticello a couple weeks ago.
Sure.
And, you know, you're driving, what is it, Thomas Jefferson
Parkway.
Parkway.
Yeah.
And all these cars, all this traffic, and then they all turn off into Monticello. And we're still going. We keep going all the way out
Like,
here.
what's over there?
Yeah. He's just not getting the same love as Jefferson, so why is that?
There's a lot of reasons. For whatever reason, though he was incredibly popular in his political life, he had a political career in which he held a record number of elected offices. He doesn't seem to have the same kind of, let's say, posthumous cult of personality.
James Monroe was the last founding father president and the last president of the so-called Virginia Dynasty, the group of 4 Virginia presidents, part of the first 5 presidents in American history. He spent more than 50 years of his life serving the public, from soldier to governor to diplomat to freaking president. That's most of his life spent sacrificing his own wants and desires to help the new nation he loved so much.
From 1775 to 1825, he was involved in every major aspect of the birth, and for a few months, Monroe was really running the country de facto, telling Andrew Jackson, move your troops from Alabama, get to New Orleans, because that's next. Going to Baltimore and working with them on the defense of that city after Washington had burned down.
Today, most historians remember Monroe as a stabilizing figure in a young republic.
He wasn't flashy, but did a lot of important behind-the-scenes work expanding American power. As president, he was well respected by people with a wide range of different political beliefs. He brought Americans together, and due to this, newspapers rarely criticized him.
He remains one of the few American presidents to remain very popular the entire time he was in office.
I know it's hard to imagine for Americans today, but his presidency marked a time when there was basically only one major political party in charge, and everybody seemed okay with it. Heck, his time as president is still often known as the era of good feelings.
Yeah, here in the year 2025, it doesn't feel like the era of good feelings to me. Still, despite his popularity, even American history dorks like myself tend to not know that much about Monroe.
Sure, they might remember him for the Monroe Doctrine, but remember, That wasn't even written by him, man.
There are several possible reasons why Monroe remains obscure in history.
First of all, he's often just overshadowed by the big names around him. I mean, literally around him. They were his friends. Friends like Madison, Jefferson, and Washington.
Imagine George H.W. Bush following Ronald Reagan, and then another Ronald Reagan, and then another Ronald Reagan, and then becoming president. You know, you're not going to come across nearly as charismatic as those guys.
He wasn't a dramatic communicator. He was a fairly chill and modest dude. Not only that, he was in charge during a relatively quiet time in American history. Due to this, we think of him as a steward, not a transformer.
And in history, we often remember those who rise up during tumultuous times.
Think of Washington stepping up to lead during the American Revolution, or Lincoln stepping up to lead, well, during the American Civil War, or FDR stepping up to lead, well, during the Great Depression and World War II.
Often we don't remember the good leaders during the boring times because, well, it's too boring.
I hope this video wasn't too boring for you.
Oh crap. Was it too boring? I'm sorry. Dang it. Dang it. I mean, I even had different film angles here to try to spice it up. I even came to his house, or what's left of it. The freaking thing's buried in the ground and they forgot about it. I did the best I could here. I'm doing the best I can.
Know how I know you're smart? You've been watching an educational video for fun. I know you. You like to exercise your brain like I do. And you want to know a great way to exercise your brain? Brilliant. Seriously, Brilliant. That's the name of the app. Brilliant is a learning app designed to be uniquely effective. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts. A method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. Brilliant helps you build understanding from the ground up, and it has a perfect mix of engaging problems, competitive features, and daily encouragement that keeps you motivated and on track. The Brilliant app is one of my favorite ways to exercise my brain. Recently, I've been learning about LLMs. High-level stuff. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/MrBeat or scan the QR code or click on the link in the description. You know what to do. Brilliant's also giving our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Everything. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.
Another cool thing about Highland, the tour guide said this tree here is older than 300 years old. The tree was like 100 years old when Monroe lived here. So, to put that in perspective. So what do you think about James Monroe? Why don't you think the majority of Americans don't remember much about him today, despite him being so popular when he was alive? Let me know by writing your message down and turning your message into a paper airplane to fly to me. Thanks to my family for once again coming out here to help me film on location at Highland and risking their lives with the bugs. And thank you for staying curious.
You done? I couldn't.
I'll never be done.